Good morning, everyone. Chris, thank you for that introduction. No pressure there, though, right? So I was wondering, they said they were going to play music for us coming up, and I wondered if it was going to be, Jackson 5 or something, and I'm not sure if the tone, it's supposed to reflect the tone of the panel up here, because I think actually we're going to be quite a bit more engaging. Sorry. So I'm a primary care physician at Mass General, and I've been there since 1992. And when I started, everything was on paper. Everything that I did was on paper. And I would come to clinic every day, and there would be stacks and stacks of paper. And also, there was a lot of paper that was pretty useless. There was also missing paper, so very frequently I didn't have the information that I needed to have the conversation that I wanted to have and needed to have with my patient. And now, pretty much everything I do is on the computer. There is almost no more interaction and communication. My mailbox is been getting lighter and lighter and lighter, to the point where I sign documents coming in from outside the organization electronically. Everything is digital. That transformation took a long time. Actually, I first started using electronic medical record in 1994. And so it was no small feat to go from where we were all on paper to all electronic. And now we've got the mountains of data that transition has created. And how are we using that data to improve care and bend the cost curve? So I had the very good fortune of Peter Orszag, to my left here, introduced me to Bill Gates at a dinner. We were, Bill Gates wanted to understand how we're going to bend the cost curve. And there was a lot of discussion about, is it regulation, is it payment policy, or is it innovation? And Bill said, if I had to choose, I would like to innovate my way out of this cost problem rather than regulate my way out of the cost problem. But the question is that innovation there? Like, what is spurring that innovation, and what will that innovation look like? So I'm looking forward to we have a great panel here. We're going to have that discussion, talking about innovation, payment policy, and artificial intelligence. So to my immediate left, Roy Beveridge is the Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer of Humana. Next to him is Leonard of Oleo, CEO of Lyft and an Assistant Professor at Harvard, and Peter Orszag, who is currently the Vice Chairman of Investment Banking and Managing Director of Lazard, Ferris and Company. So I'm going to start with Peter at the other end and say, Peter, tell us a little bit about yourself and make an opening statement about the role of AI in bending the cost and access curve.
Okay, good morning, everyone. A little bit about myself. I grew up in Boston, so there's a plus there, I suppose. I am currently at Lazard Freres, but previously I had run the Office of Management and Budget in the Congressional Budget Office, which is where I had the most interaction with the policy part of this question. In my new job, I have a lot of interaction with the business side of how health services firms and actually in life sciences also are using artificial intelligence to advance the goals that they have. I was here briefly yesterday, and I saw people, there was a vote on whether AI will raise costs or reduce costs, and there were like 5 or 10 people who said it would raise costs and several hundred who said it would reduce costs. So I think the group has already voted on the question of whether AI will bend the cost curve. But I want to introduce a slightly different perspective, which is I believe that it's necessary but not sufficient. That is to say, AI will help. It's an enabling tool, but in and of itself may not produce the results that the group voted on. It needs, in particular, the right incentives for provider systems to be directed towards improving value and reducing costs, or else it won't achieve the objective that the group voted on. First, by the way, just as a quick aside, I have to just a little bit of advertising. The cost curve sort of kind of already is being bent. It's just underappreciated even in groups like this. In the most recent data that go through April of this year, so basically the first 6 months of this fiscal year, Medicare spending was up 1.8% nominal. That means if you take out inflation, you take out beneficiary growth, real per person spending in Medicare declined. And that is after 5 or 6 years of the same thing. We have had falling real per person spending in Medicare in a way that I think is widely underappreciated. So the context here is there may be things that are already happening to bring at least cost growth down. Then the question becomes, what can AI do? And I'll give you a vignette, and then I'll be brief. The vignette involves readmissions. So we all know that historically about 20% of patients were readmitted to the hospital within 30 days of discharge. That has now come down to 15 or 16%. Why is that? There are really two reasons. One is the algorithms for predicting who is at highest risk of readmission have gotten significantly better. Historically, these were terrible in terms of prediction accuracy. And if you can target the resources, there's no rocket science involved in making sure people take their meds, show up for doctor's appointments, readmission rates decline. But I don't think hospital systems and others would have acted upon that better targeting if it weren't for a change in incentives that penalized high readmissions and the expectation that we were moving towards bundled payments and accountable care organizations, other stuff that really flipped the incentives on their head for hospital systems. And then I'll just leave you with one potential, caveat to all this, which is also embedded in the readmission story. It is terrific that we can better target readmission risk and that we are aligning incentives to reduce that risk. But there's also at least some concern about two things. One, gaming, so you delay the readmission beyond the 30-day window or whatever period of time is being measured. And secondly, although I think the quality of this evidence is pretty weak, perhaps a little bit of a concern that avoiding readmission is not the ultimate objective, and are we actually succeeding in improving health? There's a little bit of evidence that the lower readmission rates may be associated with higher mortality. So just a caveat that we've got to be careful in what the objective is. But the most important point is you can have the fanciest tools in the world. They're not going to do very much unless the payment system is aligned to produce the value that you're trying to achieve.
Peter, terrific. Len.
So my name is Leonard of Oleo. I've spent the last 15 years or so trying to figure out how to make these technologies actually useful in improving healthcare. And I've had the opportunity to do so as an academic at Harvard Medical School and at the Brigham, working within the government at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and then working back here in a spinoff of the Brigham, Ariadne Labs, where I led informatics and strategic partnerships for a little while, and now as the CEO of a for-profit called Cyft, not Lyft. Or I would.
Did I say Lyft?
Yeah, you did, and
that's just the first mistake I made.
My wife wishes that. We're afraid we're a little earlier stage than that. But it's given me a great opportunity. I mean, the one thing you learn when hopping from academia to government to for-profit is that incentives are everything. And you really only get a chance to work on problems that demonstrate measurable value. And I think it's not an accident that that my company focuses very specifically on government-sponsored health plans and those that service government-sponsored health plans. More specifically, Medicaid, Medicare Advantage. We work in behavioral health. So older, sicker, poorer people, and what we do for a living is help them use all of their data to make better decisions to bend the cost curve. Which older person is most likely to fall down in the next 3 weeks so that we can send a van to homes on a Tuesday to do falls prevention. Which patients with serious mental illness are most likely to have an inpatient psychiatric admission in the next 90 days. So we're using all of this data to understand the world at a much more granular level and then make better business and clinical decisions as a result. And the reason that I mentioned that we do this in government-sponsored health plans as opposed to other types of organizations is because they represent, depending on how you measure it, there's about 5 to 13% of healthcare today that's delivered in what's called a true value-based model, true capitated value-based model. And as I mentioned, I grew up in fee-for-service hospitals and as an academic in these settings. So my greatest concern in how to bend the cost curve is that right now, very little of healthcare is paid for in a model that incentivizes what these technologies do best, which is analyze and optimize and prophesize and then customize care to individuals. And while the vast majority of our healthcare system is instead incentivized based on volume and complexity, it will be difficult to bend the cost curve as widely as we could because these technologies will, and we're already seeing this, but will predominantly be applied and invested in to increase the amount of care we can deliver and to make sure that we are reimbursed in full for the level of complexity of care that we actually deliver.
Len, terrific opening statement. We're going to get back to you on the details of what you're doing. Roy, tell us about yourself and where you see this going.
My name's Roy Beveridge. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Humana. I'm an oncologist by training, and like so many other people in this room and elsewhere, practice for 20-some years in the fee-for-service world. The fee-for-service world is a very fragmented system, and I think the discussion that has already occurred is exactly right. It's the payment methodology which changes behavior, and it's something that in the right payment methodology, AI and machine learning will be remarkably helpful with. The fee-for-service world that we live in is really a system that looks at the care of episodic sick events, whereas in a value world, what you're looking for is health, and this is where AI can really become incredibly important because it can predict the people who are more sick, as you talked about, Peter, in terms of readmissions, et cetera, but it also allows us to identify people who will become sick over time and apply resources to those individuals.
Can you tell us a little bit, Roy, about what Humana is doing in this space?
Sure. About 85% of Humana's business is in value-based care. One of the things that we've understood now for a long time is that if you can improve the health of the population as a whole, then one has less admissions, less illness, less cost. And if I'd sat here 5 years ago and said to folks that an insurer was really interested in improving the health of the population it served, most people in the room would not actually have believed me. But it actually is a business imperative, and one that I think in the last number of years people have appreciated, and it's certainly something that we have spent considerable effort and time with. So let's go through some data to explain some of this. Patients with diabetes have a per member per month cost of X. If a patient has diabetes and a behavioral health issue, their PMPM cost is about 4 times. So a very simple AI tool is, can you identify the patients who have diabetes and in fact have behavioral health issues and may have social determinant issues, and if you start looking at that group, you can then begin to use your resources from a population health standpoint to help those individuals that then improve the health of the population as a whole.
So Roy, and I'll get to you guys, I promise, but I'm going to follow up with that because you mentioned actually social determinants, clinical, and financial. That suggests that you are merging some significantly different data streams in order to arrive at that. Can you say a word about that?
I would say that a number of years ago, most payers looked at claims data and said, this is a remarkable amount of information. We can learn a lot about someone. But I don't think until recently, the world has really appreciated how important social determinants of health are. So where someone lives, are they socially isolated? Do they have food insecurity? Do they have transportation issues? These are huge problems. And as you begin to look at, say, food insecurity, you realize that it's not just that they can't afford food. It may be that they've got transportation problems or they don't have a family infrastructure to help them. So when you look at readmission rates, somewhere between 1/3 and 50% of patients don't take their medicines. But it's usually more than just giving them the medicine. It's figuring out and contextualizing the person. Why are they not taking their medicine? And that's where AI becomes really important, to understand at an individual level, looking at the data that you've got, why is it that this person has this problem? And unless you understand that, you really can't address it and get them the resources to improve their health.
Great, thanks, Roy. So now I'm going to turn back to Peter, and Peter, I'm going to try to push you a little, and that is, I know you like that challenge, but isn't it possible that the workforce efficiencies that are created by having computers do much of the legwork that currently physicians and nurses do, that even in a fee-for-service world, that those efficiencies would be advantageous to the provider? And for example, I know there's a lot of discussion here about radiology and the use of computers to read films, the use of computers to read pathology slides, the use of computers to tee up processes in the delivery of healthcare, which make the providers much more efficient, and therefore create margin for them where they may not have margin now. Is that going to help with the cost and access problem in healthcare? And do you actually see that as actually a realistic expectation?
Look, I guess two things. One, that process, which by the way is not unique to healthcare, the same debate is going on in lots of other fields with regard to man versus machine and the degree to which there's complementarity versus substitution. But let's take your argument that there will be some degree of substitution. I think the radiology example is a good one. The goal is not to do more scans necessarily. Okay, that's where you were going with this. Oh, look, the computer will allow us to read more scans, and we can just do more, and that's productivity enhancing and margin enhancing. That's not really the objective if you're generating unnecessary scans. So I would say at this point, the core problem is the massive variation. In fact, some of your own research, just to push it back to you, showing dramatic and unwarranted variation in the order entry rates for these scans across physicians in a way that is not medically warranted. So rather than the sort of labor substitution part, I think where the AI could help, but it comes back to it's probably not going to do that much in the current payment environment, is looking on a risk-adjusted basis at this variation and trying to explain why it is. Because once physicians buy into an apples-to-apples comparison, I do think competitive pressure comes out and no one wants to be the outlier. I'll supplement that by saying I don't want to come across as too negative here on the payment environment, because I am personally very, very happy that a bunch of reporters at Politico decided to stake out private aviation terminals. Not because I dislike, not because I have anything against former Secretary Price personally, although I do. But more importantly, because I think he had a bugaboo about many of these alternative payment models in a way that was very harmful to moving the whole payment system forward. The private payers are trying, and that's great, but the only entity, in my opinion, that can really move the entire system on a national basis in this direction is Medicare, and Secretary Price was stopping that from happening. I think Alex Lazard has a much different perspective, and we're going to see CMS kind of back on track, and I think that's a really helpful thing for all of the topics that we're discussing.
Peter, that's great, because it leads right into my question for Len about the, I want to see if I picked up on what you said. You said the people who are hiring your company, Cyft, were actually people who are themselves under value-based purchasing. So did I get that right? And is the implication there that if you are an AI company in healthcare trying to sell, that you're selling into people who are under a payment system that rewards that kind of process?
Yeah, well, I think the first mistake you can make is calling yourself an AI company in healthcare. Nobody's buying AI. It's not a product. It's a capability. People buy solutions to their most pressing problems, and I just speaking from my own, I think as a researcher who had been working in this space for some time, I was absolutely convinced, based on the 50 years of research that had been done and my own experience in implementing these technologies, that this capability had tremendous potential. But I also learned quickly that healthcare is not one industry. It's probably 30 plus. There's no such thing as a single $3.2 trillion industry. And then when you identify the sub-industry that you're focused on, then you very quickly have to identify 1, 2, 3 problems that this particular set of capabilities can make the greatest impact for. And so again, for us, knowing what these technologies can do, it became an obvious choice to focus them on Medicaid and Medicare plans, and what we were, third-party carve-outs that take on caring for subpopulations within them, because they get paid. They're able to keep money by keeping people healthy and out of the hospital, keeping their membership satisfied and with the plan. And so, yeah, for us to create a sustainable company, we had to figure out where in healthcare does it pay to deliver healthcare more efficiently. And
can you give us a couple of examples of where you see the market ripening?
Yes, but in my very small sliver of healthcare, or in other parts?
Either one.
Yeah, I think honestly that's one of the challenges, Tim, is that when we talk about how AI will bend the cost curve, keep in mind, you read one article and it's talking about AI will transform healthcare and it's replacing radiologists. And then you read another article with the same headline and it's Alexa reordering your meds. So the first problem is, if we're talking about solutions to very specific problems, then we can talk about whether or not it'll bend the cost curve and how, as opposed to AI in general, which again it's like saying, will math improve healthcare, or will software improve healthcare? This is a hard conversation to have. In my very specific sliver, it's not an accident that we're focused on what we call precision care management, individuals to very specific interventions, and even more narrowly, we don't do this for the general population. We do this for geriatrics, folks with behavioral health challenges, because any clinician will tell you that not all patients experience the same pathways or are at risk. Although the vast majority of the tools we have used to figure out who really does need our help make the inherent assumption that the high-risk pregnancy and the geriatric nearing end of life will end up in the hospital for the same reasons. They tend to just go at claims data and apply the same 5 to 7 variables, which gives back to the teams the older, sicker people with the most readmissions now needing more of your help, which care managers love. And so the very specific problems in that narrow sliver of healthcare that we have found you can get paid for solving is precision care management, which is really just another way of saying cost savings on the clinical side. Making sure that people are in the appropriate risk strata. And in the Medicaid world, every state has a different set of risk strata. And if you don't know how acute a patient is, then you're not able to get the resources to pay for them, and that's a revenue play. That's getting the money you need to care for people. And then the third is member retention. Knowing in advance which members are likely to leave a health plan is a big deal, especially in a Medicaid plan where you're investing significant dollars in stabilizing the health of your members. And we've figured out how to know who's likely to leave and why and when before they leave, which allows customer service to become, for the first time, proactive instead of reactive. What had been happening, what still happens widely is you do a random survey of 5% of the people that left your plan, and from that you try to make decisions as to how to improve your customer service. In every other industry, we've just moved way beyond that. I mean, Amazon, Netflix, Walmart, and the rest of them have figured out how to break problems into very small parts and then attack them systematically, knowing what's likely to happen for that very narrow subgroup. So that's where the opportunity is, at least in the value-based side, at least in my very small sliver of value-based care.
Terrific. Well, that was great. I can see how it would be very valuable information to be able to predict movement of your customers in healthcare, just as it is in every other industry, and that's pretty new to healthcare. Is that your experience, Roy? That are you seeing this same phenomenon?
Without question, and everything that you're saying is exactly correct. I think the problem when I hear what you're saying, and Tim, in terms of what I hear you say, so you say, you know, my inbox is becoming much less full. Everything is on my electronic health record. Everything is, you know, I can sign, and that is the common platform. Mm-hmm. So that is wonderful for you, but you know, 10 to 15% of physicians in the country still don't have electronic health records. The most common way for a large number of physicians to get information is through a fax machine. A very large number of physicians don't want electronic payments because they're worried about the security of the systems. The problem, if we're going to make all this work, is something that you and partners have dealt with, which is the interoperability, the connection between you and your colleagues. Elsewhere in the United States, interoperability is a very large problem, in that if someone is in a hospital system, goes to an emergency room outside that immediate system, and then goes back to see their physician in a different system, which is very, very common, the entity which has responsibility for the health of that patient doesn't have visibility for what has happened with that patient. And not infrequently, they do not know what the medication reconciliation is for the patient. And so interoperability, this ability to get information from all different facets of the medical system, the ecosystem, is really important. And until we get that, a lot of the power that we're talking about in terms of AI is just very segmented. And so we've not really unbridled the potential that exists to improve the health of all of these folks who need it, including everyone in this room.
Great. So I'm going to do just try to summarize in very few words the comments here. So Peter Orszag, necessary but not sufficient. Okay. Len, it was, let me say, it was segmentation, breaking down the industry into its component parts and solving specific problems through better identification and stratification. And Roy, I heard multiple data streams the data streams are not yet complete. In some areas they are, but in other areas they are still quite fragmented. But the potential for total capture is what gives us, of those data streams, is what gives us the most leverage to solve problems. And we're still working on that.
And the focus on health care versus sick care. Because unless you focus on the health care, then people are going to go right back to the sick care, and that's not where you're going to drive the savings.
Terrific.
Can I make one other really quick point about how hard it is to change behavior, which is key here, which is before we came on stage, the one instruction we were given was that we shouldn't just turn to the moderator and talk this way. Instead, we should talk this way. And I've noticed we all said, absolutely, we won't do that. We'll talk to the audience. Behavior is very hard to change.
Was that an admonishment of the moderator that just happened there? Like,
No, it just means the three folks you got aren't very educable.
All right, well, we're going to turn now to your questions. And we've got a whole host of them here. So I saw, can the business of AI-driven solutions survive in a risk-sharing model environment? Are we looking for efficiency or throughput/growth? So basically, taking those two as, it sounds like exclusive of each other, efficiency or growth. Peter, thoughts on that?
Sorry, but the question was, can AI, the first part of the question?
Yeah, will AI deliver on, will AI-driven solutions survive in a risk-sharing model environment?
I think not only survive, I mean, I guess that was our point, not only survive, but thrive. I think they will thrive better in a, for two reasons, in a value-based payment world. The first is that I think many of the solutions are better geared to improving value, and so it's sort of more naturally aligned. But then secondly, and perhaps just as importantly, as we just demonstrated, behavior is, I'm going to now not violate my own rule. Hi, everyone. Behavior is very hard to change, and when you are being forced externally to change by a change in the payment system, you are more eager to seek out new tools and new capabilities. So the AI revolution, if you will have more fertile ground when the provider systems are jostled a little bit by the change in payment. So it's both better alignment and more receptivity to it, basically, among management systems.
Great. Len, you wanted to comment?
Just quick, so I agree completely with everything that was just said. And also, we've learned to take, we put more than 50, these guys? Okay. We put more than 50% of our contract value at risk because we're working with risk-bearing entities. And if that's what they have to do to survive, then we think it's important to follow suit. And I think the other, the question referred to an AI company. I think it's also important to note that in any of the areas we operate, the actual AI part is maybe 10% of the work. It's a deep understanding of the problem. It's the design work. It's the implementation work. Every time the best predictions in the world are merely suggestions until action is taken, which means that every time we engage, we're involved in change management. And so I also just want to sort of touch upon that idea of an AI company. That's like calling any software company a database company because it features databases. And I do hope we get to the point where describing your company as an AI company is just as ridiculous as describing your company as a database company because it stores data somewhere. And I think that's an important point that's often missed, especially with all of the excitement around AI is it's a hammer. It doesn't build the house on its own. You need a blueprint and carpenter and expertise and the rest of things.
Terrific, Len. Roy, so I have another question for you.
Sure.
And this is a great opportunity because you may have heard that sometimes healthcare providers and insurance companies don't have the best of relationship. I want to assure you, although I just met Roy, that we have a great relationship. and it's on the foundation of that great relationship that I get to ask this question.
Oh boy.
Which is, financial transaction costs in healthcare in the United States are multiple of the financial transaction costs of healthcare in any other country. And that has to do with actually the complexity of our the transactions. I've heard it said, I don't know if this is true, so don't quote it, but I've heard it said that the cost of a single financial transaction in healthcare is about $3.75. I know in banking, it's a fraction of a penny. And so there is an enormous amount of savings on the back end of healthcare. Will AI help us to sort of reduce that? And Roy, how are we going to work together to get that done?
You know, you're exactly right. When I was in practice for many years, the role of the payer was, in effect, to be the intermediary between me, the provider, and the person who was paying the bill, namely the employer. So the role of the insurer at that point was that of a regulatory system, and it was a mother may I approach. So of course there's going to be conflict in any fee-for-service world because the incentives are not aligned. In a value world where the provider is paid for quality and outcomes, that is completely aligned with what the insurer or payer is aligned with. So the interesting thing is that currently 66, 68% of the physician relationships that we have in Humana are around value-based contracts. What the providers are asking of us, the payer, is give us data, give us information, give us the ability to take care of our patients well. And so the relationship when you have aligned incentives are remarkably good. In fact, really very good. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to look at you when there. Now, so that brings up the other point, which is hard for a lot of folks to understand initially. Physicians, by and large, have believed for a long time that if you're going to have increased quality, there have to be increased costs. And one of the things that AI and machine learning has done in terms of identifying correct patient populations that need more resources is that if you take Medicare Advantage, the costs are actually 15% less, and the quality scores, if you use HEDIS or any other measure, are about 15 to 20% greater than in traditional fee-for-service. So if you can align incentives, this is where AI becomes powerful, and this is where you and I can go have a beer in the evening.
I'll look forward to that. Peter, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just two things quickly. First, I agree completely that as the payment system moves, the traditional problems become somewhat attenuated. But we do, even in these new payment systems, have a lot of issues around the baseline and how providers are paid. There's a new proposal out to move accountable care organizations and other alternative payment models to a Medicare Advantage type reimbursement structure, which I think makes a lot of sense, but it also then puts even more pressure on the risk adjustment in Medicare Advantage. And that's an area, by the way, where we could significantly improve with AI capabilities. So the risk adjuster that Medicare uses can only explain, the HCC risk adjuster can only explain like about 15% of the 1 year ahead variation in costs. If you layer in clinical data, lab tests, some socioeconomic data, you can get that up to 50, 60, I mean, dramatically higher. So the first thing is, I agree, but there is this kind of underbelly about risk adjustment that I think we need to pay attention to. The other thing is, with regard to the residual fee-for-service payment structure, which is still the chassis on which a lot of the alternative payment models ride, and then still is part of the reimbursement, a significant part of the reimbursement system writ large. I think there's massive improvement that's possible by basically getting rid of the redundant claims piece of things and integrating the clinical data and claims formation and processing directly. In other words, instead of having something done and then you enter it separately in this claims over here on the claims side, the claims are driven directly from the electronic health record and generated automatically, eliminating pre and post adjudication, because the only thing you're adjudicating then is the algorithm that's generating the claim off of the electronic health record, and it's a much more efficient system. It takes out a lot of that, especially manual and other gunk that's in the system, and I would hope that within the next 5 to 10 years, that is the way that payment is made, that it's driven directly off of electronic health records.
So I'm going to move to another question, which is a common question that comes up in any technology diffusion issue, which is you've all described what I'll characterize as the stack of requirements that you put AI on top of once you've got the electronic health record, once you've got the data feeds, once you've organized the data sufficiently, and you've identified the problems to which you've used that hammer as a tool, and you've reached at the top of that stack really a very different level of performance. But actually, that whole stack requires quite a bit of investment and is not likely, at least early on, to be equally distributed. Are we going to live in a world of the haves and have-nots, organized delivery systems that actually have the whole stack, and then those that don't? And do you see the potential for actually disparities developing as a direct result of the success of artificial intelligence? So
I'll just be brief. Yes, and I think this is one of the reasons why you're seeing along this dimension increasing returns to scale, with a lot of entities trying to get not only bigger but also vertically integrate so they have more diverse sets of data. But doing this stuff is not easy. It requires a variety of data sources, and it requires an investment, especially in the analytics piece of it. And once you've done it, the marginal cost of including another patient in that is either close to zero, or it might even be in some cases negative, to the extent that it improves the information for all the existing clients. So I think this is one of the big forces that's driving a lot of transformation in healthcare services writ large.
Len?
So I'm actually a bit worried that just because of our incentive model, we're going to lose our edge when it comes to innovating in AI and healthcare. And we've already seen that some of the earlier wins in delivering healthcare more effectively and turning cell phones into diagnostic devices for melanoma, retinal scans, et cetera, these are being adopted more widely in other countries versus our own because of our regulatory system, and also because there isn't incentive to invest as heavily in technologies that help us gain efficiency. So I'm a bit worried that because of our legacy system and structures, because of the lock-in of the large information systems that we have, others may have more of a disruptive advantage because they don't have to spend 2 years wrestling access to the IT closet in the ways that large institutions in this country do. The other related issue there is this idea of the IT productivity paradox, where in the 90s, we were installing all of these large-scale systems, and researchers noticed that after installing a large information system, productivity actually went down. And the reason for that is because when we install large systems on top of legacy workflows, we try to automate the old way of doing things. And what we realize is we've actually just added a layer of administration as opposed to rethinking the way the work could be performed as a result of these new technologies and the opportunities they present. And I think the classic example that everyone loves to complain about, and with good reason, is the electronic health record. We took a 40-year-old architecture that was designed to automate liability protection, billing, and then narrative discussion one-to-one. So 80% of the electronic health record is narrative. We can't use it to learn from. We've layered on 80 quality measures, and clinicians are furious with how their lives have become largely administratively related. Why? Because we automated paper as opposed to rethinking what could be possible, and we had the wrong incentives when we layered that infrastructure to begin with.
Sounds encouraging.
Yeah.
Roy.
I wonder whether with the free exchange of information interoperability, with Blue Button, and with app development that's going to follow all of that, whether we're not going to have significant disruption within the system as a whole. So I'm not, I think reading 5 or 10 years out is going to be challenging. I think it depends on the rate of free flow of information. CMS's Blue Button 2, we have to see how that goes. We've got, more than 100 entities looking at app development for CMS data right now. I think we have to see how that plays out. But I think it brings the possibility of other entities coming in and doing things differently in a very disruptive manner.
Great. So we have 1 minute left for each of you to make a final statement. So I'll pick on Peter first. He's got a look on his face like he has something to say.
No, that was misleading. But look, I think maybe the other thing I just to close on is despite the fact that the payment system needs to come along, and despite the fact that we're going to have hiccups along the way, I think undoubtedly, and I'm sure I won't even ask for a raise of hands because I think it will be so disproportionate, it's almost unquestionable in my mind that the quality of healthcare 10 years from now will be significantly better than it is today, and it's already better than it was a decade ago, in no small part because we're going to have a much better data enriched and analytically fed healthcare system. So I think it's both as a patient and as a kind of participant, I think it's a very exciting time. There are a lot of problems, sure, but let's not lose the sense of optimism because I don't think anyone would want to trade healthcare 10 or 20 years from now for healthcare 10 or 20 years ago. Great.
Len?
I mean, so what's exciting about these technologies is that they allow us to learn in ways that we hadn't been able to in the past. Right? 11 years ago, the Institute of Medicine put out this crazy idea of a learning healthcare system where healthcare delivery systems could learn from yesterday's data to improve the care delivered today. I think it's very, very recent that we now have the data and the introduction of methods that allow us to actually achieve that. And the fact that we now have companies focused on helping healthcare learn and improve in ways that were never before possible is incredibly encouraging. But I think we also have to square up with the challenges and not get caught in the hype of how this is going to absolutely transform healthcare. The people in this room are the people that are going to be fighting the fights on a daily basis to try to make this a better healthcare system. And so I think it's critically important to look clear-eyed at the challenges we have ahead of us to allow this to achieve its full potential.
Roy, last word.
So 10 to 15 years from now, I think the prediction is that we'll all be under value-based care, where entities will be reimbursed for outcomes as opposed to this segmented, fragmented fee-for-service world. However, right now, 34% of Medicare recipients have chosen MA, and the vast majority are still on fee-for-service. On the commercial side, the vast majority of us are still in fee-for-service arrangements. From a physician standpoint, they're living in two different worlds right now. They've got the problem of, I've got to be successful in fee-for-service world, and I've got to be successful in this new value world. And physicians, as are all people, don't do well when there is this bifurcated complexity. So yes, 10 to 15 years, I think things will be wonderful, but I think the transition for the next number of years is going to be very painful.
Yeah. Peter Slavin, the president of Mass General Hospital, describes that situation of being under two different payment systems at the same time as driving a car with your foot on the accelerator and on the brake at the same time. And like, that's probably not good for your car, right? So with that, optimism, but some bumps ahead in the road. I hope you'll join me in thanking our terrific panel here today.